Day one of the trial was all about finding my guilt or innocence. Unfortunately, going into the trial, I felt like this was so unfair. I was not allowed to argue what I really wanted to argue, namely that there are portions in the Book of Discipline that are wonderful, things that say that people, all people, are sacred worth, and that United Methodist ministers are supposed to minister equally to all people, regardless of gender, nationality, race, socioeconomic status, and sexual orientation. And I wanted to use those passages and say, but I was obedient to those passages in the Book of Discipline. Yes, there are the other parts, paragraph 27 and 2 on the other hand, but I was faithful to those parts. I was not allowed to argue that way because Bishop Wood said, you can't argue with one portion of the discipline over against another because the Book of Discipline is not on trial. You are on trial. The only thing I was allowed on that first day was to take a witness stand myself. I wasn't allowed any other witnesses. I wasn't allowed any evidence. The only thing I was supposed to say in the stand was, I performed this wedding for my son. My lawyers, my counsels, had this great idea. Last minute, it was on the morning of the trial. My lawyer said to my counsel, Bob, why don't you ask Frank in the witness stand about his life? Have him talk about his ministry, his family, how he became a minister, and all those good things, because none of the people in the jury, none of those pastors actually knew me. Had they known me, they would have been recused. They would have been excused and dismissed. And that's what we did. That's what we did. And so Bob asked me, and I started to share about my life and my family and my college ministry and my ministry and what I was able to accomplish over the years. And then I shared about my son Tim, how he came out as being gay, the same story I shared with you earlier. And nobody stopped me. So I continued, and I shared about how I performed this wedding and how I informed my superiors. And then I shared about when Tim asked me to marry him. And I used the parable of the Good Samaritan to make my case, and nobody stopped me. I wasn't allowed to, originally, I wasn't allowed to say any of this stuff, but neither Bishop Gwynn nor the council of the church stopped me. So I said, my son was like this person, this beaten up person in the parable of the Good Samaritan. He was in the streets, bleeding, and he needed my help. I could not turn my back on him. I had to help my son. I could not pass by on the other side of the road like the priest and the Levite did. Because, they had to go to Jerusalem to conduct services, and they could not get blood on themselves, and they had to remain ritually clean. And I said, but Jesus taught us that this person in the street who's hurting is our neighbor, and this happened to be my son, and I just had to help my son because I had not helped him. Had I refused to perform this wedding, I would have just pushed him even further away after all that he had experienced, after all that he had gone through, because of the doctrine of the church. I may have become ritually unclean and broken a rule in the Book of Discipline, but I had to help my son. And isn't that what Jesus teaches us? And I felt great. I felt great as I thought I really actually got my whole defense in. Differently than I wanted to argue, but I got a really good defense in. And then something else happened. The council for the church got up and had this horrible closing statement. He said, love has never trumped law in church history.
Oh.
And I heard gasps like this one going through the room because there were a lot of supporters in the room. And then he started to quote from Jude and talked about immorality in the last days and how God was going to judge us. And then he literally said to to the jurors over here, he said, if you do not find Reverend Schaefer guilty, you will have to answer on Judgment Day for yourself. And the speech was so painful. I heard a noise behind me, and I looked around. Here were all of the LGBT supporters standing in silent protest of what they were hearing. And the council for the church noticed it too and turned around and he looked at Bishop Gwynn and he said, Bishop, aren't you going to stop them? And in another show of grace, Bishop Gwynn said, no, you're almost finished, just continue. So when I sat at the dinner table that night with my counsel, I felt good. I thought I had a chance to be acquitted. So I asked them, how big would it be if I got acquitted today? And they said, it would be huge. It would be huge for the LGBT movement in our church, but it's not going to happen. And I knew they were right once we were gathered back that evening in that gym, and the jury walked in, and none of them established eye contact with me. I knew there was bad news. And the verdict was read by Bishop Gwynn that I was found guilty of both counts. I had 2 charges against me. And I'm here to tell you that you cannot emotionally prepare for a verdict like that. I thought I was prepared. I knew there was a good chance I would be found guilty. But to actually hear it read from an official of the United Methodist Church that represents the entire church, in the hearing of my family, of my friends, of my enemies, of the entire church and the entire world, because there were actually members of the press in the room as well. I felt so embarrassed and I felt so devastated. The church that I had espoused as my faith tradition, all of my 4 children were baptized in the United Methodist. We had worship in the United Methodist Church. For 20 years I had served this church for 20 years. And I felt devastated at that point. But there was a day too of the trial. And on that day we heard testimony. I was finally allowed to get some testimony. I had some really awesome witnesses. I had Dr. Thomas Frank, the most renowned expert on the discipline, testified on my behalf, and his testimony was wonderful. Had he been allowed to testify the day before, I'm sure I would have at least been acquitted of 1 charge. Reverend Janet Poole was another one who was so wonderful. She shared about how the discipline as well as the Bible really don't talk about a punitive action in terms of excluding somebody who was found guilty, but how there is restorative justice, how justice and punishment is really for the purpose of restoring the person back into the community. And she had such a great speech that people actually started to applaud. That's actually when Bishop Gwynn lost it, and he actually got really mad and stopped the people. And in his southern accent, I have to say, he was really that was really charming the way he spoke. But I was amazed at how he chided us, and at the same time was still hospitable. You know, something you can only find in the South. He said something like, if you do this again, we will ask you to remove yourself from the room. We will ask you. I was like, wow, this is kind of ingenious. You know? We won't kick you out. We will ask you to leave the room. When my son took the stand on that day, it was the most emotional moment for me. I was so proud of my son. Here he was, sharing about the pain and about the darkness he experienced because of this doctrine we have in the Book of Discipline. Because he heard all of this at his annual conference. He shared openly his pain, and he shared his story basically with the bully, his bully that put him in that place. And I was so proud of him because he did it with so much grace and so much love. He never targeted anybody personally. He only targeted this doctrine that is responsible, for all of this homophobic doctrine, this language we have in the Book of Discipline. I remember afterwards, after the trial, I spoke to one of our supporters, Richard Kirk. He was totally dissolved in tears when he heard Tim's testimony. He's a 70-year-old man, and he said to me, "Frank, this was my testimony. This is my testimony. I experienced the exact same thing as a gay man. I felt pushed away by the church. I felt like the church was saying, there's no salvation for you. You're going to hell." And I considered suicide as well. And he said, what really got to me is the fact that it is still happening. 40 years later, this 40-year younger man has the same exact testimony. Our church hasn't really moved an inch, and it's just devastated him. We're reduced into tears. During the lunch break on that day, I had to wrestle with something, and it wasn't easy. My counsels had really coached me. On that day, I was supposed to give another testimony, and they tried to get me to be very political about my statements in that witness stand. They coached me and said, if somebody asks you, if the council of the church asks you, will you promise never to do a gay marriage again? They said, say something like, I can't answer that question because it all depends. Nobody can predict their actions of the future. It's a hypothetical question. And they said, when you make your statement, don't say this word, but use this word, and phrase it this way and not that way. And it was a carefully crafted statement. And it was all based on the intention to keep me a clergyman and not have me defraud. During that lunch break, I felt in my heart that I could not make that statement and read that statement. I felt righteous anger within me, especially after my son had testified about his pain and what he went through and how he was hardened by the doctrine of the church, and nobody had acknowledged it. And I was hurt because in the meantime, as this case became known, I had been contacted by so many LGBT folks, and many of them had shared their story with me. And I was outraged that this harm was continued as long as we have this law and as we have this language, this homophobic language in our doctrine, in our discipline. And I knew I could not make this political statement. I knew I had to stand, not only for my son Tim and for my other two gay children. I had to stand for all those, and with all those that had contacted me and had shared their very, very sad story with me. I had to stand with all those that had for years asked, and where is my pastor? Why isn't my pastor standing with me? I knew I had to tell the jury what I felt in my heart. And so I prayed. I remember going to my room in the cabin, and I was sitting on my bunk bed, and I prayed out loud. I didn't even care if anybody heard me outside of my room. And I said, God, is this really what you want me to do? Is this what I have to do? And if it is, Lord, what am I going to do if they take my credentials? Being a United Methodist pastor is all I know how to be. I've done this for 20 years. What else can I do? Where's my paycheck going to come from? What about my health insurance? And what about my two sons that are in school and still depend on my income? What about my security? What am I going to do? And at that moment, it was like God reminded me of what Jesus did. And I think for us Christians, that's a natural thought. We go there automatically. But I saw it in a different light. And I for the very first time, considered what an act of love this was on Jesus' part for everybody. What a huge act of love. And he didn't just lose his credentials and his ministry and his security. He gave his whole life, and he did it with so much grace and so much love. So much so that he even prayed for those who put him on that cross, who nailed him on that cross. The Roman soldiers, at the foot of the cross, he prayed, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. And all of a sudden, losing my credentials and losing my job didn't seem that significant. And I knew what I had to do. And so I remember sitting down in the courtroom again, and I knew I was going to be up next, and I started to think about the words, and I wasn't sure that those words were going to come out of me. I was so nervous. In fact, I was so nervous I felt sick to my stomach. And I started to scribble down sentences and words, and it didn't come together. And I was called to take the stand again. And I remember I didn't even take that sheet because I couldn't even read my own handwriting. I was so nervous. I sat down in that stand, and something remarkable happened. I looked over to where my family was seated. My son Tim, my daughter Debbie, and my wife Bridget. And I saw them looking at me with love and support in their eyes. And I looked beyond them, and there were all of these supporters in rainbow-colored stools, and they were all around the room. And they were all looking at me with love and support. It was almost like I felt their prayers. I felt their prayers, and I felt strength coming back into me, and I felt confidence. And I witnessed myself in the stand addressing the jury and saying things that were just so. The words just flowed and they came out. And really, one of the first things I did when I got the official transcript of the court, I went back to read that speech to see if it really came out this well. And sure enough, it did. I actually want to read to you a part of the transcript, that last part of my speech that I gave to the jury. But before I do, I want to really give credit where credit is due. There's a scripture passage in Mark 13:11 that says, whenever you are arrested and